Thank you.
Okay, let's have a technical discussion about the very raw implementation of work. It's not even work item, just the first merge request. And I wanted to have a short demo and explain what we have in this MR and why. Some things are probably not obvious. So let's check what do we have there. Let me share my screen. So it's just this, like how it looks like on the front end. Nothing is there, only the text for the upcoming title widget. And the only thing to check here on the front end side is the current root. As long as we don't have workspaces now, work items live under projects. It will be changed as soon as we have workspaces, because I guess that's where we want to have work items, right? But the implementation, what I really wanted to discuss here is the very basic small schema that I created, and check with our backend if it makes sense, and check with our frontend if this makes sense as well to implement on the frontend side. So for now, we have two enums for work item type and widget type as well. For work items, we just so far have only feature. Of course, this is very draft based. And for widget type, we would need widget types on the front end. I will explain a bit later why in particular case. We have an interface for work item widgets with the type so far. I'm not sure if we won't have ID for work item widgets. This is something to decide, because I believe with custom widgets, we might have need an ID, but so far it doesn't have them. Title widget that implements this interface with a content text. Thanks to Kushal for mentioning this shouldn't be content, but content text. This is basic text widget, so we only have text here. And this is the most controversial part so far, because work item has widgets as an array of widget entities. Right now on our issuables, we have all the properties like assignees, labels, and so on at this level. And the change with work items is we want to have them as an array. In this particular case, why do we want to have them as an array on the front end? So on our component, when we fetch data for work items, we would be able to have this little computation, maybe somewhere in the helpers, when we find out the widget type from this array, and we render only those widgets that we have in the list. The main questions to backend are, first of all, will we be able to encapsulate widgets as a list of properties, not on the properties right now, how they're on the issuable? This is important because maybe it will be too heavy on the backend. And second one, will we be able to only send to the front end the array of the widgets that is available on the type? So for example, for feature, we have what, like title, label, something else. Of course, we can do the hard coding on the front end. So we fetch only the work item type, and somewhere on the front end, we have the mapping that feature allows us to have these widgets. But I can imagine that in the future, with custom work item types, it will be problematic to do this encoding all the time on the front end whenever a user creates a new type. Second question is for the front end mostly. Currently, I'm fetching, because this is client query, all the data for the widgets on the root query. Again, this probably will be really heavy, especially for widgets like assignees when we're fetching project members and permissions for project members. So maybe it's a good idea to separate this for initial call, like a query that defines the structure of work item when we're fetching type, and just a list of widgets, probably with GraphQL Startup.js really early in the lifecycle of the application. And then widgets are responsible for fetching their own data, probably with unbatched queries. So something like this, and let's discuss. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and let's go through the agenda. I think Alexandru, is he there? No.
Yeah, I missed the part of the meeting because I was not being let in, but
sorry.
Yeah, like I don't know how we can structure it on the back end so that like we can help front end to be as abstract and as generic as possible. Like my first thought was, can we have some sort of a simplified structure where we return the widgets that are available for the work item with the API URLs, so that then front end can make these calls to fetch basically every single work item, every single widget, and that works fine, I guess, for the details page. Where you have a single work item, I'm not sure that works out well for a list of work items, right? Then you have like a ton of these calls depending on how many widgets you want to show on that list. But yeah, that's I think where we should kind of try and think through.
So if we are planning to have a generic work item widget, and assuming that it would allow us to create basically obtain list using GraphQL query without complicating the backend, then I think is it really necessary for backend to have the presentation details information available? Because for backend it would largely be a blob of text, regardless of how front end decides to present it on UI. So for example, a work item might have title and description for starters. And assignees is something which is very specific, but at least for the basic ones, we can rely on having a generic work item widget so that it is only the front end which will be responsible for how to render a particular item without backend needing to worry about it. Assignees is something that is again part of issues and MRs anyway. So that can be treated as a separate node for a particular query. And that will allow us to work with array easily compared to how we would do otherwise in case we have different work item types.
Yeah,
Regarding
the thought was
first,
that on the back, like we would not want to load front end with the decision of what widget to ask from the backend, right? Like we would want to say, here's the idea of the work item, and the backend would decide, well, here is the list of the widgets that you want to display, and then how you want them to be rendered is up to you. You render it as a list, as a text, as a whatever you want to do, right? But like to be as generic as possible, like if we are tying the name of the widget, so like if front end needs to know the name of the widget in order to render it, that's not very generic, especially as we move towards custom widgets, right? And then just providing a list of the widgets, then on the front end, you only need to know what type of widget this is. Is it a text widget? Is it a list widget? Is it a date widget? And so on. And then you have this specific logic on the front end on how to render that. So this is where I was like coming from.
my comment about this is later in the agenda, but it's related. I suspect that I can imagine how it would be possible to return a list of widgets including this data, because my understanding is that it goes against the GraphQL API idea that you can just specifically select what data you want, so you can drill down in the schema structure. Yeah, so I pasted a comment of the sample of the query we should still be able to use. Like, you want to get a list of assignees for each issue, or you want to get the names of the assignees of the issue. And if we return just an array of widgets, and inside this array we iterate through all the data, it's not possible or easy for users to use this structure to just get specific data they need. This schema basically would expect that you always get all the widgets you want from the backend, which is not the case in GraphQL, I think. So I was wondering if we could, instead of array, if we could change this to a hash or object, or how is it called in GraphQL? And front end would still have to. We could return a list of widget names, as Alexandru mentioned, but front end would still then have to decide or build a list of attributes it needs for each widget, because each widget can contain multiple data. For example, if you have a widget for parent-child hierarchy, it will contain multiple attributes or different attributes, I guess. So I expect that this schema for each widget may be different. And if we would try to make it to universal, then we are losing the benefit of GraphQL schema to well define the schema types.
I'm not sure we're losing this in particular case, because I guess that for a long time we will have a limited set of widgets. If work items can be really custom, the set of widgets will be more or less hard-coded. So I can imagine that we have an interface for the widget, and we have types, limited set of types that are implementing this interface. And in this particular case, we can use or not use this. This is good to discuss, by the way. If it's fine for backend to only return titles, types, or something of the widget, let's call it identifiers. We need an identifier, like assignees, right? It can be just in an enum. It's still fine for the front end, because we can have a mapping. That's okay. We have assignees in the list. We mount a view tree that will perform a proper GraphQL query that fetches assignees. It's still fine. I'm not sure how hard will be load again on the backend, and what is actually harder for the backend. Because if we fetch all the widgets with all the data on initial query, the complexity might be super high.
Yeah.
If we have queries for every particular widget, we will probably need to unbatch them, because if we batch, the complexity will be super high again. So this is something to decide on the backend side, how it's the most optimal, because we can survive with just identifiers on the initial query.
Yeah, also like for the batches, I was thinking or entertaining the idea that you may, like as we discussed, we will return a simplified version of the widgets where you have this identifier and the URL by which you can access it. And then just because you already loaded 100 work items, we will need to have some sort of a GraphQL endpoint or whatever, where you send an array of work items for and fetch this specific widget for those items, right? So then you don't have to do it for every single work item. You do it for a batch of work items, but you'd still have, like, if you need to display 5 widgets, you'll have 5 requests basically.
Yeah, in fact, the initial list of widgets that the query would provide can just be a string array, as simple as that. And it would just have the exact widget name that front end cares about. And we are anyway planning to not load entire data on the initial page load. Instead, we want individual widgets to make queries for their own data that they are responsible for. So if we have the list of strings which represent each widget type, then like Natalia mentioned, we can mount all the relevant components on UI and then let that components be responsible for making actual queries with relevant keys that we are looking for that specific user.
Yeah, like the complexity, I think, on the back end is that we will need to have all these kind of types of resolvers, one for the list of the widgets, another one for the specific widget to be fetched, and so on and so forth. So again, I guess on the back end, we'll need to think through how we can make it maintainable in a way, because that can go like complex really fast. But yeah.
Regarding the polymorphism on the backend for GraphQL, actually, it is possible to return an array of different types. We could, I'll send a link here. There's an example in the GraphQL Ruby docs where Like it defines an interface called type retail item, and then there's a type car, type purse. They all have the price field, but then they could also have their own fields. And then on the front end, you just do the syntax where you do ... on whatever I want. If it's an assignee widget, I want the extra fields, right? Like the user name, user ID, or whatever. And if it's a locked discussion widget, it's just a, locked true or false. And yeah, so it is possible to, to have a polymorphic like field or array in GraphQL on the back end. So I'm not sure if we could, use that. I think it's possible and shouldn't be too hard, I guess, to use.
Yeah, one thing on that, like I think it would make sense to have interfaces for all of these types, like user list, and that will include assignees, reviewers, whatever user list you need to have, because then we can return a single type for the front end and front end doesn't have to be like tied to assignees or reviewers and so on, and so on for the Boolean widgets, for date widgets and so on. So like, it will be nice to have this abstraction and interfaces on the back end from the beginning, sort of, as we think this through.
Yeah, I was also thinking about that, like, but I was kind of unsure. Like, it may be extracting things too early because, assignees and reviewers may look the same right now, but they're slightly different. Even right now, they're not exactly the same. We show a different set of data when we do reviewers. Like, if on the reviewer dropdown, you have like code owner, if you're a code owner or not. On the approvers, you only have the can merge or not. And like, yeah, these slight differences just complicates things. And it might be simpler initially to just have different like assignee list widget, reviewer list widget, and then, extract it in the future if needed. But yeah, not so sure about that part.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One question I wanted to ask about, Alexandru, you mentioned that if you would first return just a list of identifiers of the enabled widgets, and then we would need multiple separate requests to get this data. It's not exact. Naively, I would expect that in first request, we get a list of enabled identifiers, and in the one single query, we can build a list of for the second query, we can build exactly what we need based on the information what widgets are enabled. Why we would need 5 separate requests to get, for example, assignees or weight.
I was thinking about it more for the list view, where you have like, if you have 100 work items and you need to fetch all the assignees or all the related issues for all 100 items, that will be a very big query. Like, it may time out if you do it. Like, we can do it in one query because you have all the attributes, right? You have all the widgets that you need to fetch. You can build the complex GraphQL query. The problem that I'm kind of foreseeing in a way is that that can be too much data, too much complexity to return from the backend.
Yeah, I agree. Our problem is that we are targeting listing of work items, but yeah, I don't think it's feasible to just get everything for all work item types on listing page. Yeah,
for the details page, yeah, we can do just one query. We build the query as we need it, and we can fetch it everything. But like, again, for the consistency, for maybe we don't want to maintain these two types of doing stuff. I don't know. Like, this is up for discussion. It's just like my brainstorming kind of ideas.
Well, yeah. So in scope of this brainstorming, what would block us to just so supposing that the use case is that we are on a list page and we need to fetch some widget specific data, which may be included only for some of the issue types or work item types. For example, we need to get assignees for types where it's available, but for others, we ignore them basically, or we show nothing. Yeah. Is that the case?
Yep.
So what blocks us to just from front end send a request which refers to give me assignees for all work item types, and for types where it's not supported, we return just nil.
No, nothing. It is like this is what I was suggesting as well. Like, give me all the assignees for this list of issue IDs or work item IDs, right? So front end will pass the work item IDs that they want assignees for, right? So give me assignees for this list of work items.
Yeah,
And then on the back end, we fetch it, and then we find out that these are not available for this or that, and return what we have.
Could we alternatively, because thinking of that for list view of like a list of items, rather than loading like one item at a time, we're loading columns, like we're loading all the assignees and then all the labels. Could we just, if we did like one query to fetch all the widget data, like the detail view for a single work item, and then we could get that for say 5 or some manageable number, or and then just kind of, so if you had 100 work items on a page, then you do 20 queries for 5 each, and then you get all the details for each.
So you're saying like it's better user experience to just have items loaded in
Just
this way,
have single items loaded rather than columns of partial.
Yeah, that can be an option, sure. Like, this is why we are discussing, I guess.
Yeah, that was.
I'm more like, again, with my backend mindset, I'm more thinking, how do I load most data in a most optimal way, sort of thing, right? So,
yeah.
So
So
the splitway has. Sorry, you go, Jan.
Yeah, just specifically to this, I'm still missing the point why we need to load data per column or per row, because with GraphQL you can get all the columns you need for the listing, or what is the blocker for it? Why can you include the assignees as part of the single query?
I like, for me, it's the performance part. Because if you have, let's say you have a list view that asks for assignees, related issues, I don't know what else, like big lists, all the labels and so on. So what we will need to do, we'll need to do a lot of these queries in one big query. I don't like, maybe I'm just concerned with something that is not there. But from the performance point of view, we'll need to do a lot of these joins and prepare a lot of the data to return it all in one. So I think it will be slower than having multiple requests to fill in the data, if that makes sense.
It is what we already do now, though, right?
Yeah, so I think that this is rather something to discuss with UX to make sure that we don't show overloaded list page with all the possible work items data. Yeah, so or we can offload optional or custom attributes or work item specific data, widget specific data to a separate query, but it doesn't have to be separate query per each widget, if I understand the original idea properly. Yeah, so you can decide, okay, so these 3 widgets are very, very expensive, but we still need them. So we will offload them to a separate request, which is done separately, but it's up to front end how it decides to load the data, right? We don't need backend specific API for this, or I'm still missing the point or concern.
One concern I have with going with a single big query to fetch all the data is users on slower connections, or user who are specifically on the go and trying to access a specific page. And imagine a situation where we are trying to load 50 work items, which might be an average case scenario going forward. The payload size would be so huge that if someone is on a flaky LTE connection, then they might end up with a blank page. I'd rather want at least some data to show up with individual parts being loaded after the page loads, instead of waiting with a blank page while the data is being loaded. Because we have encountered this with roadmap multiple times, where we were trying to load all 500, 600 epics on roadmap page at once. And the payload size was easily going past 1 megabyte on any instance. And then you would see on specifically on slower connection, it becomes apparent that user is presented with the loading animation waiting for data to load. So I'd rather want multiple queries happening in parallel, so that if one query fails, there is still a way, at least on the UX side, to resolve it. So for example, I've seen several UXs where if there are multiple smaller widgets on the page, and if one of the widget fails to load something, there is an option to reload that specific widget instead of reloading the entire page. So we may introduce a similar design on work items as well, if it is possible, instead of going with a single query.
Yeah, I completely agree. To clarify, I don't suggest we should use one heavy query to load the whole page. I would completely agree that we just load the simple fast list and then fetch any additional data. I just wasn't sure in what way we need to fetch this additional data. Yeah, so, but it still seems to me that we still decide what attributes we need for each request.
Yeah, I think even with the work items array, polymorphic array that we mentioned a while ago, you could specify an argument. If this was the work item list page, you could specify an argument, work item, you want the ID, you want the name, and then you want the widgets. And you could specify an argument like only title, labels, and something, right? And it would only return those widgets for those, if available for that list. So we wouldn't like do a very huge payload, even if we had the work items widgets array.
Cool.
I think it's possible. I'm not sure, but yeah.
So you'd limit them in the initial request to the work item. You'd say only include these fields.
Yeah, we can include and skip, right?
Yeah, I was wondering that as well for list view versus detail when we're just including a subset of the widgets.
All right, on the detail view, we probably want the whole array, right? But yeah,
everything. Yeah.
And there will be preference to rather load the polymorphic list and then trying to get the list of widgets, and then as Henrik suggested, to use on, for example, assignees, give me these attributes and so on, because we would need to then follow this approach in general for all widgets. I guess we don't want probably to support two different ways how to expose widgets, right? I mean, instead of exposing the hash of widgets by identifier, is there the preference for exposing the list of widgets?
Content, it's definitely a preference, because if we have hash of identifiers, I can imagine that for the moment when we have our hard-coded work item types, it's still not a problem. You say, okay, if it's feature, fetch me assigners, labels, and whatever, again, with a spread operator, because this is polymorphic type. But as soon as we go to custom types, hash properties would become really problematic, because for every added work item type, we would need to define a query where frontend should know what is available and what should be returned for this particular custom type.
But we need to do the same way even with the polymorphic way, right? Because even for when returning the list, we would still need to define on this custom type.
But this is on widgets. But this is on widgets. We define this on widgets because, like, again, my main concern, widgets is a limited list. Definitely limited, because we cannot implement custom widgets so far, especially on the front end. Even if user defines some interesting widget, we have limited set of components. For work items, it will be one generic page that takes a list of widgets, known one, and just displays them. That's why when we have hash properties on work item, it's good to say, okay, issuables have assignees. I know this. So on issuables, fetch me assignees, labels, and milestones. And then user creates a custom type for work item. Page will still work. It accepts this, but we don't know what, the frontend is not aware about what properties are there. If you return a list of these widgets from the backend defines the visibility of the widgets. Backend says, okay, for feature you have this display. Frontend takes the list and we can handle like list of names or list of properties and handle it properly. If we don't have a list, if we have hash properties, we will create this super monstrous query, like work item, on feature, fetch me assignees labels, on requirement, fetch me this, on something else with spread operators. And with every custom type of work item you add to the backend, frontend will need to open this query and manually add this work item type to this query. This is a problem for custom. If we don't go custom, we can stick with the hash properties.
Well, no, I would expect that front backend would return a list of available widgets either way, no matter if we return list or hash. Yeah. You should be always be able to know what widgets are enabled for each type.
Yeah, I think I prefer the list, but I think even with the hash that Jan mentioned, I don't think you need like the list of available widgets hard-coded per type, per work item type, because I think it's possible to do like work item type, then query, I want the assignee widget, I want the labels widget. Even if that work item type does not have assignee or label, then we just return nil or something from the backend. I guess
Yeah,
that's also possible.
But then the trick is that you cannot distinguish if assignee is not supported or assignee is not set. Yeah, I mean for assignees it's an array, but if it would be a scalar value, you couldn't distinguish between unset and not supported values.
Yeah, so I guess the widgets array is also like just simpler to understand, I guess, for everyone. And I'm not sure what the downsides are, so versus a hash.
Yeah, for me it would be a little bit more complex construction of the queries, but maybe this is not too important. Maybe it's something also to, either way, I think it would be great to check the final decision with the GraphQL team, because they might weigh in whether if one of these options is preferred.
Oh, sorry. I was just say it's an interesting idea. I didn't think about having a hash, but with nullable fields. So if you make them nullable, all of them, like assignees, labels, whatever, it might be a good idea to fetch everything on the work item level and just check on the front end if we have null. But will it be okay to have them nullable? We can handle this on the front end, but for backend, does it even make sense to make properties like assignees of issuable nullable?
We already do that, right? Or for some attributes, I think that is acceptable, but maybe others know better.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. It's just that we can't return, for example, assignees. We can't return just a raw array of users, right? Because we don't know if it's an like empty array, or like we could differentiate between an empty array and nil, but that's, you know, kind of tricky. And so I think the safer way is to like have like assignee widget null, or assignee widget a hash or an object that has like a user's property or something, you know, or yeah, that's more like less prone to mistakes. Or it could be an object with a count and then with a user's array with a, you know, something.
I'm finding a bit hard to follow the difference between list and hash. And I'd appreciate if someone can afterwards sometime just create a sample test or a sample query with like how would it look and how would the response look, so that we can then discuss in more detail what are the pros and cons. Like right now, I'm really struggling to fit it in my head.
Right. Which issue is that? I'm planning to write one, just not sure where. Is it
Yeah,
in Natalia's MR or like?
it can be in the NMR, it can be wherever. I just like when I visually see something, it's easier for me to understand that. When everyone talks, it's like a bit fast. So I'm slow in processing, so I'm sorry for that.
You can think about it like a current issuable, for example. Imagine current issuable that we have assignees, labels, and whatnot. Imagine that we have all the properties, all the possible widgets there on the work item. Like you can fetch all of them, like absolutely all properties, but they are nullable. And then backend returns us null for those that are not available for this work item. So for example, I have a feature, I fetch absolutely all properties, assignees, labels, milestones, whatever else, but backend says me, okay, for requirement, there is no assignees, null. Nil, okay, for now it's for our JavaScript. And when I get null for this hash property, I don't render the widget. Something like this.
Yeah, I would suggest instead of discussing this on the merge requests, discuss it on the technical discussion issue, because there was already touched the topic, and there is a link to also all the technical discussion issues where it was touched. So maybe it would be great to keep it on one place instead of fragmenting the discussion.
I think if we just look at the difference of having an array of widgets versus hash of widgets, from the implementation standpoint, the way we would work with array is that we would walk through each item within the array without having to worry about what the type would be before even visiting that particular item in the iteration. And once we encounter the type, we would know on the front end, like, okay, this is the widget type, and for this, we need this component to be mounted in so and so place. When it comes to hash, we would need to have some form of prior understanding of what are the hashes available and how to treat with a specific hash. So it is just as simple as iterating over an array versus dealing with a map where you would need to know the key name first.
Yeah, I agree with Kushal. For simple array, it's like very easy mode for the front end to just have a list as array and just handle it with our components that we have.
Well, I like to, and I might be getting this wrong. Like either way, you need to have some sort of an indicator on the widget, what type it is, right? So if it's in a hash, like if I understand it correctly, you'll get the assignees, and then within the assignees, you need to have widget. You need to say that this is a user type widget, and the same for the array. You'll get the assignees in array, but then you also need to have this type for the front end. So this is where would need to adjust either with the hash object, whatever you want to call it, or an array to include this kind of description of the type of the widget that we are returning. And then you can iterate through the hash the same way as you iterate through the array, right? Because you get all the properties of the issuable, or all the widgets in the sense, which all the properties which are actually widgets, and then go from, for each widget you determine the type and do the same thing, basically, I think. But again, like, don't quote me on that, because I'm a bit lost in the difference between one and the other.
So I think one of the key features as far as work items goes is ability to add custom widgets, because they would basically act as what Jira has with custom fields. And that is where pushing for array comes into play instead of going with the hash. So if you look at the implementation of issues and MRs, those have fixed set of metadatas which are supported. So for example, an issue would always have assignees. It is just that it would either be an empty list or it would have some people assigned to it. But when it comes to work items, we may come up with a set of widgets which will always be available on work items. Either they would be empty in value or there would be some value. But the moment we introduce custom types into work items, that's when we would feel the need to have some form of way to dynamically introduce those items without having to predetermining what widgets we need to show. So that's where one more item pushed into an array is much easier than to introduce a new hash item for which we would need a prior knowledge of.
Yeah, again, if someone can take the lead and describe the two options, and then we can go ahead and discuss, because we will not figure it out here, I don't think. But yeah, just taking the lead and doing the query, doing what we are expecting to return, and then we can discuss and make decisions. I'm not sure where we are in the agenda, though. At what point?
I think it went to the pre-discussion already, but it's fine.
Yeah, I think there is a Flores point there somewhere with the mutations. If we are, yeah, I have a point about the data structure, but I think that can be discussed as part of the query that I've just mentioned with the array or hash, so we can determine what kind of structure we need those widgets to return data in what form and shape. So we can skip that, I think. But then going to Flores notice there on the updates. So that's a mutation kind of query. It's not a query, it's a mutation.
I think it makes sense again for the front end to have this mutation that is dynamic, or just pass an identifier and update it. And we actually did this partly for the issue, for the update issue mutation, when you can just update the fields. But again, this should be checked with our GraphQL experts team backend, because there was an ongoing discussion about mutation granularity and how coarse or fine-grained should mutation be, and if it's fine for backend to have this kind of mutation.
But this leads towards more of a coarse type of mutation, right? Where you have everything handled basically by a single mutation, and then on the backend we decide how we update things, which I think is what, well, it was not a decision, but the recommendation is like, let's use coarse as much as we can, and then if we need the fine grained, then let's do that, because it's much harder to maintain a lot of the fine grained mutations on the backend. Like you can end up with a huge list of mutations that you need to maintain on the backend for that reason.
Why do we ever need fine-grained mutations? Like if I can update the you know, due time by a coarse mutation, but just update that one thing, why do I need
subscriptions? Because if you have coarse-grained queries, you'll have coarse-grained subscriptions. And we had a case for our assignees subscription, the only one that we had. When you were updating anything on the issue, it was triggered because it was listening to the issue. So you change milestone and your assignee subscription is triggered, returning your data, which creates an additional load on the backend.
But can it be like, can a widget be subscribed through this coarse query, but like only?
I think it can, but we would need to have like coarse-grained query mutation and fine-grained subscriptions, just only listening to the change of the field. Probably yes. This is mostly up to Heinrich because he is more of an expert here.
Yeah, actually we did that already. Like the subscription right now is assignees updated. So we have coarse-grained mutation, like a update issue mutation, but in the update issue service, we just trigger the event on the, on the if where assignees changes. So that's also possible.
So I think we can say that having this coarse grain mutation is fine for work item. I mean, if we have it for issue, it shouldn't be a real big complexity for the backend to do the same for the work item. I know it's hard to measure right now when there is no real work on the backend side, but at least an estimation.
Estimation of adding mutation for updating?
Yeah, like a coarse-grained one when we update work item with work item ID and the field that we pass. Like if we want to update only one field on work item, and we update the whole work item there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have thought about this further on backend side, but my thoughts so far would be that, as Henrik suggested earlier, I would expect that our components or widgets will be to some extent isolated concerns. So if we update a work item, we just run some update action on all of the widgets for the work item, and each of them takes care of updating the necessary attributes or associations. But it's probably not interesting to front end. I'm not sure what is estimation for this actually.
Flori's request was if it wouldn't be too much of a complexity for the backend to perform this update. So for example, we send this coarse-grained mutation with to update description from description widget, the same kind of mutation with a different parameter to update like labels or something else. I guess it's not really complex, but again, something to test on the backend, I guess.
Yeah, so the mutation will be always update work item, and it would differ just by set of the attributes you change. It might be multiple or single attribute. I think this direction makes sense to me. I don't see any specific blocker.
Are we still able to have the like type checking validation of the value field if we're passing in like widget identifier being dynamic? Then value is always just going to be a string, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it depends on in what format or structure we pass the attributes being updated. Yeah. I guess this is something to check with graphical experts, but I would expect
Also,
that we would still check widget specific types for attributes for the input.
okay. And
Yeah,
similar.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, please, I'm muting.
I don't know how that plays out with the custom widgets and so on. Like, to me, it feels like we need on the backend, we don't have this identifier on the widget. It's just like a field in the issues table that will probably change with the custom widget, custom fields, and so on. So, like, I'm not sure how that plays out later on when we have custom fields. You'll need to pass this identifier, and we'll need to somehow find the custom field and update that. But for the normal widgets, we will rely on the attribute name, or do we move towards having these identifiers for everything in some shape or form? Like, I don't exactly, I cannot imagine right now how that will work out. But it does make sense to have this coarse grade mutation anyway, and in some form or shape, pass an work item ID, pass an identifier, and update it, or even pass multiple work item IDs and pass these multiple identifiers with the values and do the batch update. So it does make sense to have a single place to do this stuff.
Yeah, I would also expect that we will want to structure the input attribute parameters or arguments inside each widget you want to update. So it might be some kind of hash. For example, what we do now with negated parameters or arguments, you also pass a nested hash of negated arguments. So I can imagine that, for example, the preference would be that you pass widget identifier, and for the widget identifier you pass a hash of arguments you want to change. Yeah. So it would be hash of hashes or something like that.
I posted on the technical discussion issue how I think the queries with the widget list would look like.
I think we are gone through the entire agenda, and we are at pretty much at time, on 5 minutes past actually. So do we have anything else? Do we want anything else to discuss? Or maybe someone is waiting on some answer and I just missed it. And I don't want to shut it off for anyone or anything. I really enjoy being with you here. So
No, I don't think we have any more items. And thanks to Heinrich, I'm reading through the queries. It looks super nice. It was actually what I was meaning on title widget and the sinus widget. And I like the idea of passing only something that kind of really nicely limits us to the list of work items. So you've got like, I want only title and the sinus. This is a great outcome for the last one. Thanks everyone for joining the call. It was super nice to know that like the MR makes sense and we can continue working, creating some mock schema, maybe in a proper relay connections as well for widgets, because right now they don't have nodes. And I know that backend is mostly busy right now with managed work. So like double thanks to all of you for joining and helping and giving any ideas. And hopefully we will have more meetings as implementation, because we will start to we'll try to stick to engineering discussion right now. If we have any upcoming MRs, I will just link them there as a separate thread and let's discuss. So we will have one huge issue with all the discussions. And thanks again.
yeah, thank you everyone. It was super helpful for me at least, and I learned a lot and like cleared a lot of things on my mind. So thanks.
Me too. Thank you all.
Have a nice
Me
day.
too. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.